What most Americans don't realize is that last week, when Donald Trump publicly demanded $2.8 trillion in what he called overdue compensation from Canada, he wasn't negotiating in any traditional sense. What he was doing, knowingly or not, was exposing the institutional collapse of American economic diplomacy in the clearest terms imaginable. And then came Mark Carney's three-word response, which has now been viewed over 50 million times across social media. It didn't go viral simply because it was clever. It went viral because it captured, in perfect clarity, a truth that experts on both sides of the border had been thinking for months, but were reluctant to voice publicly. Speaking as someone who has spent decades inside Republican institutions, what worries me isn't Canada's reaction, it's Washington's inability to grasp how power functions in today's world. This wasn't diplomacy. This was a shakedown dressed up as trade policy, and the spectacular backfire tells us more about the current state of American influence than any speech or report ever could. Let's break down exactly what happened, because the story you've heard in the headlines only scratches the surface. The official narrative might sound routine if you've been tracking trade tensions over recent years. At a private fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago, Trump claimed that decades of trade imbalances, resource agreements, and what he called sweetheart deals had cost the United States $2.8 trillion in lost wealth. He demanded immediate compensation from Canada, warning of severe economic consequences if Ottawa refused. But the figure was offered without documentation, methodology, or any reference to the frameworks under which the two nations have long operated. From Trump's perspective, this was strength in action, America finally standing up to a smaller neighbor that had supposedly been taking advantage for too long. The reasoning, if it can be called that, was simple. Canada needs access to American markets more than America needs Canadian resources. Therefore, pressure, applied correctly, would force compliance. This has been the guiding principle behind his approach to international relations for years. The problem is that logic only works if your assumptions about dependence and leverage are accurate. In this case, they were catastrophically wrong, revealing how little Trump and his advisors understand the economic relationship they claim to be reshaping through threats. And then came Carney's response. Asked about the $2.8 trillion demand during a press conference in Ottawa, he didn't launch into speeches about Canadian sovereignty, trade law, or historical precedent. He didn't get defensive. He didn't get angry. He looked straight into the camera and said three words that immediately resonated with economists, trade lawyers, and diplomatic professionals worldwide. Show your work. Delivered with calm authority rooted in deep understanding of how modern economies operate, those three words didn't just undermine Trump's claim, they exposed the intellectual framework behind it. Because when you demand $2.8 trillion from a trading partner, you're not making a political statement, you're making a mathematical one. And unlike politics, mathematics requires proof. That's where the story moves from embarrassing to dangerous. When Canadian officials asked for the analysis behind the number, Washington didn't produce evidence. The Treasury Department spoke of ongoing review, the Commerce Department cited classified methodologies, and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office claimed proprietary calculations. In short, there was no work to show. The $2.8 trillion figure was political theater masquerading as economic reasoning. And theater doesn't just fail when it meets sophisticated partners, it backfires spectacularly. Carney understood this immediately. With years at the helm of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, he knows that economic claims demand evidence. When that evidence is absent, the claim reveals more than it proves. It shows either ignorance of the system being manipulated or confidence that the audience won't notice. From Canada's perspective, both possibilities were problematic. Either the Americans were economically incompetent at the highest levels, or they were acting in bad faith. Neither scenario suggested that ordinary diplomacy would succeed. So Carney did not debate Trump's claim, he exposed the process that generated it. Show your work wasn't just a reply, it was a challenge to the very approach behind the demand. And it resonated far beyond a single trade dispute. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened, something I had never seen in 3 decades of observing American foreign policy. Allies, partners, and even neutral countries started openly questioning not just US positions, but American competence itself. Editorial boards in London, Frankfurt, and Tokyo all ran similar analyses. If the United States couldn't provide basic documentation for a $2.8 trillion claim against its closest trading partner, What did that say about its other economic positions? The answer was devastating. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that has been building for years, in which American economic diplomacy increasingly relies on assertion instead of analysis, pressure instead of persuasion, and threats instead of evidence. European officials, speaking on background, began labeling US trade positions as post-empirical. Asian partners started insisting on independent verification of American economic data before entering any negotiations. Even Mexico, despite its vulnerability to US influence, began demanding third-party arbitration in trade disputes. The credibility American diplomats spent decades building was being systematically undermined by leaders who confused volume with authority and stubbornness with strength. Canada's response accelerated that decline by making the underlying incompetence impossible to ignore. But the damage wasn't merely diplomatic, it was economic. When trading partners question your competence, they don't just negotiate differently, they plan differently. They hedge differently. They start treating your market as unreliable, your currency as volatile, and your institutions as fragile. These shifts are already visible, though many Americans haven't fully grasped them yet. Canadian pension funds have quietly reduced their exposure to US assets over the past 18 months. European manufacturers are sourcing critical components from suppliers outside the US, not because American products are inferior, but because American trade policy has become unpredictable. Asian investors, especially in infrastructure and clean energy, are redirecting capital toward projects that don't require US regulatory approval or political stability. These changes rarely make headlines, but over time they erode American economic leverage far more effectively than any single trade dispute ever could. And this is where Carney's approach becomes strategically brilliant. By insisting on evidence instead of offering counter-arguments, he shifted the conversation to terrain where Canada had every advantage. Canadian trade positions are thoroughly documented, analyzed, and defensible, while American positions increasingly are not. When Ottawa released its comprehensive analysis of bilateral trade flows, resource agreements, and investment patterns, it didn't merely contradict Trump's claims, it made clear that serious economic discussion requires institutional capacity that Canada maintains and the United States appears to have abandoned. The analysis revealed, for example, that American consumers save roughly $2.1 billion annually thanks to Canadian energy exports, that American manufacturers rely on Canadian raw materials that would cost significantly more elsewhere, and that American financial institutions hold over $400 billion in Canadian assets that provide stable returns due to Canada's regulatory reliability. In short, the actual economic relationship looked nothing like Trump's narrative of American victimization. It resembled a complex network of mutual dependence, Canada supplying stability, predictability, and expertise, while America provides market access and capital. When one side becomes unstable or unpredictable, the entire structure grows fragile. The viral moment wasn't just about 3 words. It represented institutional confidence. Carney could be dismissive because Canada's position was defensible. Trump couldn't provide evidence because none existed. That asymmetry revealed far more about the state of American power than any single dispute or headline ever could. For decades, the US could make demands based purely on market size and military capacity. Partners would comply not because America was always right, but because confrontation cost more than cooperation. That dynamic is changing not because the US has become weaker in absolute terms, but because its positions are less defensible, its institutions less reliable, and its leadership less competent. When partners ask you to show your work, they're not merely challenging a figure, they're questioning whether you still deserve the privileges and authority you've long assumed. Carney's 3 words crystallized that challenge, and the inability to answer revealed more about American decline than any military defeat or economic crisis ever could. What worries me most, as someone who believes in the value of American institutions, is that this moment was entirely avoidable. The US holds enormous leverage over Canada, but leverage only works when exercised competently. Demanding what you cannot justify is not strength, it is weakness. The $2.8 trillion figure wasn't merely wrong. It was strategically self-defeating, inviting scrutiny that exposed not just flaws in American economic analysis, but flaws in American economic leadership itself. Once visible, these weaknesses make projecting authority and credibility infinitely harder. History has always punished nations that confuse bluster with strategy, arrogance with confidence. What happened between Trump and Carney wasn't just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a preview of what happens when institutions fail and leadership prioritizes performance over competence. But the problem goes deeper than Trump personally or even the current administration's approach to economic policy. What we're witnessing is a systematic erosion of the institutional knowledge that once made American economic leadership both credible and effective. I've seen this pattern before in declining powers throughout history, and it follows a predictable trajectory that should alarm anyone who cares about American influence. The first stage is substituting assertion for analysis. When institutions lose their analytical capacity, they compensate by becoming louder and more insistent in their claims. Trump's $2.8 trillion demand wasn't just wrong, it was lazy. It assumed conclusions first, then scrambled to justify them afterward, rather than building arguments based on evidence. The second stage is a misunderstanding of leverage. Trump and his team clearly assumed that market size alone would force Canadian compliance. But market access only creates leverage when paired with institutional reliability. When partners cannot trust your analysis, your threats, or your commitments, they begin planning around you rather than with you. This pattern is visible across multiple relationships simultaneously. European allies are quietly diversifying their defense procurement away from American suppliers. Not because US technology is inferior, but because US export controls have become unpredictable, making long-term planning impossible. Asian partners are deliberately structuring trade relationships that exclude American participation, not out of hostility, but because American policy has grown too volatile to anchor serious economic partnerships. Even Mexico, despite its obvious geographic and economic dependence, has begun implementing contingency plans to reduce reliance on American supply chains and political stability. None of this is about sudden dislike for the United States. It's about rational actors adapting to unreliability. In this context, Carney's response crystallizes the problem perfectly. When he said, "Show your work," he wasn't just questioning a number, he was highlighting the gap between countries that maintain serious economic analysis and a superpower that seems to have abandoned it. The virality of that moment also reveals something profound about global perceptions of American competence. 3 words from a Canadian central banker generated more attention and credibility internationally than months of American diplomacy. That should be deeply concerning to anyone who understands how influence operates in the modern world. For those of us who remember when American institutions set the global standard for economic analysis and trade policy, the contrast is stark. Agencies like the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the Commerce Department once set benchmarks for rigorous, serious work. Countries studied and emulated their reports, trusting their conclusions because the analysis was meticulous and methodical. But the transformation has been gradual, subtle, yet devastating. Political appointees replacing career professionals, ideology overtaking expertise, short-term gains taking priority over long-term institutional credibility. Trump's $2.8 trillion demand represents the logical endpoint of this process. When institutions lose analytical capacity, they become tools for political messaging rather than sources of independent, objective insight. Carney, in contrast, embodies the opposite approach. His response demonstrated the institutional confidence that comes from doing the work, maintaining rigorous standards, and building positions that can withstand scrutiny. By challenging American officials to show their work, he knew they could not, because Canada had already done the heavy lifting. The subsequent Canadian analysis wasn't just a point-by-point refutation of Trump's claims. It was a demonstration of how serious countries handle complex economic relationships, comprehensive, documented, defensible everything that American economic policy has increasingly ceased to be. The ripple effects of this competence gap extend far beyond bilateral trade. When the world's largest economy can't produce credible analysis to support its major policy positions, it introduces uncertainty into global markets, investment flows, and economic planning. Investors now account for American political risk in ways that were unnecessary before, not because the US has weakened economically, but because its policy has become incoherent. Currency markets reflect this uncertainty, with increased volatility around American policy announcements. Bond markets factor in higher risk premiums for long-term US debt. Commodity markets react sharply to political developments because traders can no longer reliably anticipate policy implementation. This is the real cost of institutional decline. Not isolated bad decisions, but a system rendered unpredictable and unreliable. Canada exploited that structural weakness brilliantly. By demanding evidence rather than engaging in counter-arguments, Carney shifted the conversation to terrain where institutional competence mattered more than political theater. On this ground, Canada had every advantage. The lasting consequences of this episode extend beyond diplomatic embarrassment or short-term trade friction. They strike at the very heart of American credibility. When a close ally can publicly challenge you simply by asking you to document your claims, something far more valuable than a single negotiation is lost: the presumption of competence that underpins leadership itself. And once that presumption erodes, rebuilding it demands years of careful, consistent work, the kind of institutional investment American political culture seems increasingly ill-equipped to support. This is why Carney's 3 words are so significant. They symbolize a fundamental challenge to the assumption that America can continue leading through assertion instead of analysis, pressure instead of competence, and volume instead of substance. The fact that this challenge came from Canada, historically one of America's most reliable partners, adds another layer of importance. This wasn't adversarial confrontation, it was friendly intervention, a reality check that only genuine partners provide when they see a nation heading toward a cliff. The tragedy lies in the fact that American institutions still have the capacity to conduct serious economic analysis when allowed to operate professionally rather than politically. The Federal Reserve, despite political pressure, continues to produce world-class research. Career professionals across government maintain expertise that could support far better policy decisions if political leadership valued knowledge over ideology. But institutional capacity without institutional authority is only academic. When professional analysis is ignored for politically convenient conclusions, it becomes irrelevant, and the institutions that produce it lose credibility both domestically and internationally. Carney's response highlighted the gap between American potential and American performance. Canada may not have larger economic resources or more sophisticated technology than the US, but it has maintained norms that prioritize accuracy over convenience, analysis over assertion, and evidence over ideology. As a result, when complex economic disputes arise, Canada can engage on the merits, while America increasingly cannot. This is not a temporary political problem. It is a structural competence crisis that could take decades to resolve if American political culture ever develops the patience and humility to tackle it. History rarely punishes nations for losing power. It punishes them for failing to recognize when their methods of exercising power have become counterproductive. What transpired between Trump and Carney wasn't just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was an institutional wake-up call that American leadership seems determined to sleep through. The central question isn't whether America can still demand $2.8 trillion from Canada or any other partner. The real question is whether America can still do the work required to justify its claims, defend its positions, and maintain the credibility that makes leadership possible in an interconnected world. Carney's 3 words provided the answer, and it wasn't the one American policymakers wanted to hear. Yet it was the answer citizens need if they hope to rebuild the institutional foundation that once made American leadership respected and effective. Reclaiming credible leadership won't come from louder demands or bigger threats. It will come from patient, unglamorous work, rebuilding institutional capacity, restoring analytical standards, and earning back the trust that competent governance requires. Whether American political culture possesses the patience for that work remains uncertain, but until it does, moments like this where American pretension collides with global reality and 3 words from a Canadian central banker outweigh all the bluster of a US president will continue to define perception of American power. The truth is, what happened between Trump and Carney last week isn't just a story about one demand or one response. It's a window into the deeper challenges facing American institutions today. The United States still has enormous potential to exercise serious economic leadership, but potential alone isn't enough. Authority, credibility, and influence come from doing the work, from building evidence-based positions, from cultivating institutions that are reliable and respected. Carney's three words didn't just refute a $2.8 trillion claim, they revealed a fundamental gap between what America could do and what it is actually doing. They exposed the difference between a country with institutional discipline and one increasingly reliant on performance and bluster. For decades, American leadership was anchored in analytical rigor. The Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, and the Commerce Department set global benchmarks. Their analyses shaped markets, guided policy, and earned trust because they were rooted in careful, professional work. Over time, political appointees displaced career professionals. Ideology replaced expertise, and short-term political wins took precedence over long-term credibility. The $2.8 trillion demand represents the culmination of this process. A nation relying on assertion in place of evidence, spectacle in place of substance. Carney, by contrast, represents the enduring value of competence, discipline, and methodical analysis. His calm, pointed challenge reminded the world that serious countries operate differently and that credibility cannot be borrowed, it must be earned and maintained. The ripple effects extend far beyond the immediate trade dispute. When the United States cannot provide credible analysis for its positions, global actors respond rationally. Markets become volatile, investments are redirected, and partners hedge against unpredictability. American decisions lose their reliability, and influence erodes not because of economic weakness, but because of institutional incoherence. Canada, by maintaining rigorous processes and documented evidence, holds a strategic advantage that America has allowed to slip away. Every step in this dispute underscores the necessity of rebuilding analytical capacity, restoring trust, and demonstrating competence before asserting authority. The lesson is clear. Without institutions that can produce defensible work, leadership becomes performative, influence becomes fragile, and past advantages dissolve. Carney's three words will be remembered not because they were clever, but because they crystallized the central question of modern American power. Can the United States still demonstrate the competence necessary to justify its demands, maintain global trust, and lead effectively? The uncomfortable answer is that this moment revealed a deficit that no amount of political bravado can cover. Rebuilding credibility will take decades of patient work, of reinstating analytical standards, and of creating institutional norms that prioritize substance over showmanship. Until that work is done, moments like this, where a friendly ally exposes the gap between performance and competence, will continue to punctuate American diplomacy. The stakes are enormous, because leadership without credibility is influence without foundation. So the next time we hear about a bold American demand, a high-profile negotiation, or a dramatic policy announcement, it's worth remembering Carney's three words. They remind us that authority comes not from volume, threats, or spectacle, but from preparation, evidence, and institutional strength. They remind us that credibility is earned, not assumed. And they remind us that in an interconnected world, real power flows to those who can do the work, demonstrate competence, and maintain trust, not to those who rely on bluster alone. The question for the United States going forward isn't whether it can make demands. It's whether it can rebuild the institutional foundation necessary to make those demands meaningful. Until then, moments like this serve as a warning, a lesson, and a challenge.